These trees are a liability, Vanessa Kilbride says, clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. The board voted. They're coming down today. Behind her, 3 men in orange vests are already gassing up chainsaws. It's a Tuesday, 9:14 a.m., late October, and the cold coming off the plains smells like frost and diesel exhaust. I'm standing on my own gravel drive, coffee going cold in my hand, watching strangers walk onto my grandfather's tree line with steel. I don't say anything yet. I just start recording. Here are the numbers nobody in that HOA meeting wanted spoken out loud. 1 mile of Shelterbelt, 51 years old, planted tree by tree by a man named Otto Meacham starting in 1938. $11,000 in brush removal fees billed to homeowners who never asked for a single branch touched. $40,000 collected in what Kilbride's paperwork calls view enhancement assessments. And somewhere in a spreadsheet on her laptop, a number she thinks nobody else can see. $1.9 million, the projected value increase for Cedar Hollow Estates once the lake is visible from every back porch. By the time the snow finished falling that January, Vanessa Kilbride would owe $2.6 million in restitution, face 2 felony counts, and lose the very house she'd used as collateral to buy her seat on that board. And almost none of it, I want you to sit with that, almost none of it would be for the trees. It would be for what those trees were doing when nobody was looking. What none of them knew that morning, what none of them bothered to check before they put chainsaws to 70-year-old cottonwood and cedar, is that the Shelterbelt wasn't on HOA land at all. It sat 240 feet onto a deeded parcel my grandfather registered with the county in 1899. A parcel that had never been sold, subdivided, or annexed into their little slice of paradise. They were about to spend an afternoon destroying something that belonged to me, on a strip of dirt that belonged to me, guarded by a piece of paper older than their entire subdivision. They didn't know that yet. Vanessa Kilbride didn't know it. The board didn't know it. The 60-some families who'd bought Lakeview lots at a premium sure as hell didn't know it. I let them cut. I stood there in my barn coat with my thermos, and I let every last one of those trees come down, because I already understood something they wouldn't understand until the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the first real blizzard of the season came rolling down off the Dakota line, with nothing left standing between it and their rooftops. My name is Walter Meacham. I'm 63 years old. For 31 years, I worked for the county as a hydrologist, the last 11 of those specializing in something most people never think about until it's burying their front door: snow load, drift patterns, and the engineering of shelter belts designed to keep entire roads from disappearing under 12 feet of wind-packed snow. I know exactly what that tree line was built to do. I know exactly what happens when it's gone. And I knew, standing in my driveway that Tuesday morning, that I wasn't going to lift a finger to stop them. The Meacham Ranch sits on 1,100 acres in a shallow bowl of land where the wind comes down from the northwest with nothing to slow it for 40 miles. My grandfather Otto Meacham homesteaded this ground in 1899, the same year he built the oak table that still sits in my kitchen, the one with his initials carved crooked into the underside of the top, done by a boy who didn't yet know how to hold a chisel steady. I still eat breakfast at that table every morning. I can smell the linseed oil in the wood if I lean close enough. 70 years of it soaked into the grain. He buried his wife on a rise behind the house in 1961. He's buried beside her now, and beside them both is my father. And there's a 4th plot dug and waiting, though I try not to think too hard about that one. 3 generations of Meachams are in that ground. The 4th generation, me, was raised knowing every inch of this property the way other men know their own hands. What my grandfather understood, what he spent 51 years of his life proving, was that a shelter belt isn't decoration, it's infrastructure. He planted that first row of cottonwoods in 1938 after a blizzard killed 40 head of his cattle in a single night. Animals frozen standing up against a fence line because there was nothing to break the wind before it hit them. He planted more rows through the 40s and 50s, cedar, then hackberry, then another line of cottonwood, building what engineers like me later came to study as a textbook example of drift management. A mile long, 5 rows deep at its thickest point, angled just so against the prevailing northwest wind. It didn't just protect his cattle, it protected the low ground where, decades later, a developer would build 62 homes and call it Cedar Hollow Estates. Nobody who bought a house down there in the last 15 years had any idea that the reason their street stayed clear all winter, the reason the county plow barely had to touch their road, was a wall of trees planted by a dead man they'd never met, standing on land they didn't know wasn't theirs. I inherited the ranch when my father passed in 2009. I inherited the deed, the water rights, the mineral rights, and a filing cabinet full of documents so old the ink had gone the color of weak tea. I did not, for a long time, think much about a Shelterbelt easement buried 3 folders deep in a manila envelope marked, in my grandfather's cramped handwriting, Keep. Vanessa Kilbride moved into Cedar Hollow Estates 6 years ago. She drives a white Mercedes GLE that never has a speck of mud on it, which tells you something about a woman living 40 minutes from the nearest paved highway. She wears blazers that cost more than most people's mortgage payments and carries a clipboard everywhere like it's a badge of office, because in her mind, it is. She became HOA president 3 years ago in an election nobody else wanted to run for, and within 18 months she'd rewritten half the covenants, raised assessments twice, and started talking at every meeting about unlocking the lake view potential of the development. I didn't think much of her at first, just another woman with a clipboard and an inflated sense of jurisdiction. It wasn't until the chainsaws started that I understood exactly how far she was willing to go and exactly how much money she stood to make from doing it. The chainsaws ran for 6 hours that day. I timed it, 9:14 a.m. to 3:52 p.m. with a break for lunch. I watched from my porch through a pair of binoculars my father used for counting cattle. I wrote every time down in a notebook I keep in the kitchen drawer, the same notebook I'd used for 30 years to log rainfall and snowpack measurements for the county. Old habits. I didn't know yet how much that notebook would matter. By the time the last cottonwood came down, the whole northwest edge of my property looked like a battlefield. Stumps cut flush to the ground, some of them 4 feet across, wood chips scattered across frozen dirt, the smell of fresh-cut cedar hanging in the air where 51 years of windbreak used to stand. I walked the line that evening after the crew left, counting stumps, photographing each one with a disposable camera because I didn't trust a phone to hold up in court if it came to that. 311 trees. I have the number memorized, the way some men remember their kids' birthdays. 2 days later, an envelope showed up in my mailbox. Cedar Hollow Estates Homeowners Association letterhead, embossed, the kind of paper that costs money to print. Inside was a notice of violation, dated and signed by Vanessa Kilbride as board president, citing me for encroaching brush and deadfall debris on association-adjacent property, and assessing a fine of $1,100 due within 30 days, with a note that failure to remit would result in a lien against my property. I read it twice. Then I laughed, out loud, alone in my kitchen, hard enough that my dog lifted her head off the floor to look at me. They'd cut down my grandfather's trees, and now they were fining me for the mess they'd made cutting them. I didn't call. I didn't drive down to that clubhouse and start yelling, though God knows I wanted to. Instead, I did what 31 years with the county had trained into me. I documented. I photographed the notice, I photographed the envelope, the postmark, the letterhead. I pulled the county plat map and printed a fresh copy of my deed, the one filed in 1899 and re-recorded in 1961 and again in 2009 when I inherited the place. I drove into town and sent Vanessa Kilbride a certified letter, return receipt requested, informing her that the brush and deadfall in question was on privately deeded land outside HOA jurisdiction and requesting, in writing, the legal basis for the association's tree removal on my property. I kept a copy of every page. I logged the date I mailed it, a Thursday, 11:20 a.m., postmarked at the Hazleton post office in my notebook, right under the entry for the day the chainsaws ran. The response came faster than I expected. Not a letter, a knock on my door, Saturday morning, 8:40 a.m. Vanessa Kilbride standing on my porch in a cream-coloured coat with her clipboard tucked under one arm, and a man I didn't recognize standing a step behind her, holding a tablet like he was afraid to touch anything else. "Mr. Meacham," she said, in the tone people use when they've decided in advance you're going to be difficult. "I think there's been some confusion about property lines." "There's no confusion," I said. "I have the deed. I have the plat map. Those trees were on my land." She smiled the way you smile at someone you've already decided doesn't matter. "The association's surveyor has that parcel inside the maintenance easement. We have every right to manage vegetation that poses a safety hazard to the roadway." "Your surveyor's wrong." I held up the printed plat, didn't hand it to her, just held it where she could see the county seal stamped in the corner. "That easement you're thinking of runs along the road frontage. It's 40 feet wide. My grandfather's Shelterbelt started 240 feet back from that line and ran north for a mile. That's not maintenance easement. That's deeded ranch land, and it's mine." For just a second, less than a second, something crossed her face. Not worry, calculation. I'd worked around enough county officials and enough contractors trying to squeeze extra footage out of a right-of-way to recognize the look. She was doing math in her head, and whatever number she landed on, she decided it didn't change anything. "I'll have our attorney review it," she said. "In the meantime, the fine stands. I'd suggest you pay it before it accrues interest." She turned and walked back to her Mercedes without waiting for a response, heels clicking against my porch boards, the man with the tablet trailing behind her like a shadow that hadn't quite caught up. I stood there and watched her go, and I didn't say another word, because I'd already decided something standing in that doorway. I wasn't going to argue with her. I was going to find out exactly what she was doing, and why a woman who ran an HOA for free was suddenly driving a Mercedes she couldn't have afforded on her husband's insurance salary alone. That's when Dot Pruitt knocked on my door. Dot lives 2 lots down from the clubhouse, in a little rambler her late husband built with his own hands back in 1974. She's 78 years old, a widow for 6 years now, and she keeps an oxygen concentrator humming in her front room morning and night, the tubing trailing behind her like a leash whenever she moves from her recliner to the kitchen. Her husband Ray served 2 tours in Vietnam and came home with lungs that never fully recovered. And when he passed, Dot inherited not just his medical bills, but a body that had started failing in the same slow way his did. Decades of second-hand exposure catching up with her the way it does with wives who spend 40 years breathing the same air as the men who loved them. She showed up on my porch that Sunday afternoon holding a manila folder against her chest, moving slow, breath rattling audibly even from 6 feet away. "Walter," she said, "I need somebody who understands paperwork. Nobody else in this development will talk to me anymore since I started asking questions." I brought her inside, sat her at my grandfather's table, poured her coffee she didn't touch. She opened the folder with hands that shook slightly, arthritis or nerves, maybe both. Inside was a stack of HOA financial disclosures, obtained through a records request Dot had filed herself. An old woman with a library card and more patience than half the county officials I'd worked with for 3 decades. Assessment notices, meeting minutes, and a real estate flyer, glossy, professionally printed, advertising Cedar Hollow Estates, premium Lakeview lots now available, featuring photos of the very stretch of shoreline my grandfather's trees used to shield from wind, listing prices that made me set my own coffee cup down hard enough to slosh onto the table. "They fined me too," Dot said. $900 for a fence Ray built in 1981. Vanessa told me if I didn't pay, they'd put a lien on the house. This house, Walter. The only thing Ray ever left me. I looked at the flyer again, then at the assessment ledger, then at a line item buried on page 4, marked simply View Enhancement Assessment, Special. $40,000 collected. Homeowners billed $500 to $2,000 each, depending on lot proximity to the water. The money funneled into an account separate from the association's general fund, an account Dot's records request had, by some oversight or arrogance on Kilbride's part, actually managed to expose. I sat there at my grandfather's table with Dot Pruitt's oxygen tank humming in the corner of my kitchen, and I understood all at once that this had never been about a few dead trees or an unpaid fine. Vanessa Kilbride had cut down a 51-year-old windbreak to manufacture lake views she could sell at a premium, and she'd billed the very people whose safety that windbreak protected to pay for the privilege of losing it. "How much do you think this whole thing is worth?" Dot asked quietly. I did the math out loud, right there. 62 lots. Average price increase per lot once Lake View got stamped on the listing, plus the $40,000 in assessments, plus whatever kickback arrangement existed between Kilbride and whatever developer was moving those lots. By the time I finished, the number sitting between us on that 120-year-old table was somewhere north of $1.9 million. "That's not a fine dispute," I said. "That's fraud." Dot looked at me, oxygen line trembling slightly with each breath, and said the thing that settled it for me completely. She told me if I complained again, she'd make sure the board voted to condemn this house for code violations. Said nobody would believe an old woman over a licensed HOA president. I thought about my grandfather's Shelterbelt lying in stumps along the northwest line. I thought about the manila envelope in my filing cabinet marked Keep, the one I hadn't opened in years, the one I suddenly needed to read very, very carefully. "She's going to believe an old woman," I told Dot, "because she doesn't know yet what that old woman's neighbour happens to own." The envelope marked Keep had been sitting in my grandfather's filing cabinet for 14 years, and I'd never once needed to open it. That Sunday night, after Dot went home in the truck I drove her in myself, I finally spread its contents across the kitchen table under the yellow light of the lamp my father used to read by. Inside was everything Otto Meacham had filed with the county extension office back in 1939, the year after that first blizzard killed his cattle standing up. A cooperative agreement with the Soil Conservation Service, stamped and countersigned, laying out the exact specifications of a permanent field windbreak to be maintained in perpetuity on the northwest quarter of his deeded land. Underneath that, a hand-drawn survey, his own surveyor's initials in the corner, showing the Shelterbelt running the full mile along a strip 240 feet inside his property line, the same distance I'd told Vanessa Kilbride to her face, though I hadn't yet had the paper in hand to prove it. But it was the third document that stopped my coffee halfway to my mouth. A right-of-way agreement filed in 1961 alongside my grandmother's death certificate, granting a single 20-foot access easement across Meacham land for the purpose of snow removal equipment reaching the low ground where the county road curved down toward what was now Cedar Hollow Estates. The agreement named my grandfather as the sole grantor. It named the access point, a narrow gravel cut that ran, to this day, directly behind my equipment barn, as the only legal route wide enough for a plow truck to reach that stretch of road without crossing private land belonging to someone else entirely. There was no other way in. There never had been. The Shelterbelt had done the plow's job for 51 years by simply stopping the snow before it piled up in the first place. Now the trees were gone, and the only road wide enough to clear what came next ran straight through land I owned outright, gated at my sole discretion. I didn't call Kilbride. I didn't tell Dot yet either. I folded the documents back into the envelope, and for the first time since the chainsaw started, I let myself feel something close to patience. A hydrologist learns, if he learns anything at all, that water and snow don't care about a person's schedule. They arrive when the pressure systems say they arrive. All I had to do was wait for the sky to do what the sky was always going to do, and be ready with paper in hand when it did. Being ready meant work. Monday morning, I drove into the county courthouse and filed a formal notice of encroachment against the HOA, citing the tree removal backed by my deed, the 1939 conservation agreement, and photographs time-stamped from the day the crew came through. I paid $11 to have it entered into the public record. I requested and received 4 days later a certified letter from the County Extension Office confirming the Shelterbelt had been registered as a conservation easement, never terminated, never modified, still legally binding on whoever held title to that land. I also called Sheriff's Deputy Ray Odom,